Good morning, everyone. Today, I want to talk about a subject that is often misunderstood and oversimplified: narcissistic men and the psychological complexity behind their behavior. The term narcissist is thrown around loosely to describe anyone who is self-centered or egotistical, but true narcissism, especially narcissistic personality disorder, is much more than that. It is a deep psychological issue rooted in pain, insecurity, and emotional confusion. When we say narcissistic men are psychologically complex, we are recognizing that beneath their outward confidence and arrogance lies a complicated emotional world. Narcissism is often a defense mechanism. Many narcissistic men wear a mask of superiority, dominance, and charm to protect themselves from feelings of worthlessness or rejection. This behavior is not driven by genuine self-confidence, but rather by a desperate need to protect a fragile sense of self. Their arrogance is not power, it's protection. Often, this pattern of behavior begins in childhood. Narcissistic traits usually develop in response to either emotional neglect, harsh criticism, or conditional love. If a boy grows up learning that his worth is based only on performance or appearance, he learns to hide his real self and instead builds a false identity that gains approval. That false identity becomes his way of surviving emotionally. Though narcissistic men may appear confident, they usually lack true self-esteem. Their sense of value depends entirely on how others see them. Without admiration, praise, or control, they begin to feel empty or invisible. That's why many of their relationships become transactional. They don't feel secure unless they are the center of attention or in complete control. This brings us to their relationships. Narcissistic individuals often struggle to connect with others on a deep emotional level. They may come across as charming or charismatic at first, but over time, their inability to express empathy or genuine concern for others becomes clear. Relationships become tools to fulfill their own emotional needs rather than partnerships based on mutual respect and care. One of the biggest fears narcissistic men face is being exposed. Deep down, they're afraid people will see through their mask and uncover their insecurities. This fear of vulnerability can make them defensive, manipulative, or even aggressive. They do everything they can to maintain the image of perfection, even if it means hurting those closest to them. Many narcissistic men become addicted to power and control. They feel secure only when they are in charge, when others depend on them or fear them. This is not because they are naturally powerful, but because they fear feeling powerless. It is a psychological survival tactic, not a sign of real strength. Despite all of this, change is possible. With therapy, self-reflection, and a willingness to be vulnerable, narcissistic traits can be understood and managed. However, most narcissistic men avoid seeking help because admitting they need it feels like weakness. As a result, many remain trapped in their cycle of insecurity, unable to grow emotionally. Narcissism is often a defense mechanism. While it may seem like narcissistic men are full of themselves, the reality is often the opposite. Their exaggerated sense of importance and confidence is usually a mask to cover deep emotional wounds. These individuals may have faced rejection, criticism, or emotional neglect early in life, which caused them to feel unsafe being their true selves. To cope, they construct a false version of themselves, one that appears strong, desirable, and superior. This image becomes their armor, a way to protect themselves from vulnerability, rejection, or emotional pain. Rather than facing feelings of inadequacy, they learn to inflate their sense of self and avoid any situation that might challenge it. This is why many narcissistic behaviors, bragging, belittling others, constantly seeking validation, are not signs of genuine self-worth, but attempts to defend a fragile inner world. They are not thriving, they are surviving behind a carefully built wall of pretense. The roots of narcissism often lie in early childhood experiences. A person is not born narcissistic, rather, This personality trait typically forms as a response to the environment in which a child is raised. Many narcissistic men grew up in households where love was conditional, given only when they performed well, looked a certain way, or fulfilled the expectations of their parents. Others may have experienced emotional neglect, where their feelings were dismissed or ignored entirely. In some cases, they were excessively praised for superficial achievements, but not nurtured emotionally. This creates confusion within a child. Instead of learning that they are valued simply for being who they are, they come to believe that love must be earned through success, appearance, or control. As they grow older, they internalize the idea that their true self is not good enough, so they create a persona to gain approval. Over time, this persona becomes so dominant that they lose touch with their authentic emotions and needs. What we see as narcissism in adulthood often began as a survival tactic in childhood, a way to feel safe and worthy in an environment that didn't offer unconditional acceptance. Although narcissistic men often appear highly confident, the truth is that they usually lack genuine self-esteem. Their sense of identity is fragile, easily shaken by criticism, failure, or even being ignored. Unlike people with healthy self-worth, who feel secure regardless of outside opinions, narcissistic individuals rely heavily on external validation to feel valuable. They constantly seek praise, admiration, and attention because, deep down, they do not feel good enough on their own. This means that their self-image is not rooted in inner confidence, but in how others perceive them. If someone praises them, they feel temporarily powerful. If someone criticizes them, their entire emotional state can collapse. It's an exhausting and unstable way to live, forever depending on the reactions of others to feel okay. This deep dependence on approval is often hidden behind a facade of arrogance or charm, but underneath, there's a person who doesn't truly know or accept themselves. Their identity becomes a performance constantly adjusted to meet the expectations of others, while their real self remains unseen and undeveloped. Narcissistic men often find it difficult, if not impossible, to form and maintain healthy, emotionally balanced relationships. At the core of every meaningful relationship is empathy, the ability to understand and care about another person's feelings, but narcissistic individuals typically struggle with this because they are so focused on their own needs, fears, and image, they rarely make room for the emotions of others. In relationships, they often expect admiration, loyalty, and attention, but give very little emotional support in return. Conversations may revolve around their achievements or problems, and they may dismiss or downplay their partner's feelings. Over time, their relationships become one-sided, transactional, and draining for the other person. What's more, they often see people not as partners, but as extensions of themselves, tools for validation or success. This mindset leads to patterns of control, manipulation, or emotional neglect. Many partners of narcissistic men report feeling unseen, unheard, or emotionally isolated, even when the relationship looks fine from the outside. Intimacy, vulnerability, and compromise, which are essential to a healthy bond, often feel threatening to someone with narcissistic traits, because letting someone in too close means risking exposure of their insecurities. As a result, their connections remain shallow, unstable, or toxic, leaving both themselves and others emotionally unfulfilled. One of the most hidden but powerful aspects of narcissistic behavior is the deep fear of being exposed. Beneath the carefully constructed image of confidence and superiority lies an intense anxiety, the fear that someone might see through the act and discover their weaknesses, insecurities, or emotional wounds. This fear drives much of their behavior. Narcissistic men often go to great lengths to maintain control over how others see them. They may lie, exaggerate their achievements, avoid vulnerability, or lash out at anyone who challenges their self-image. Criticism, even when constructive, can feel like a personal attack because it threatens the illusion they work so hard to uphold. They may respond with anger, defensiveness, or even silence to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths about themselves. This constant pressure to keep up appearances creates a life of emotional tension. They are always performing, always managing impressions, and always on guard against anything that might reveal their true feelings of inadequacy. Ironically, the very thing they fear being truly seen is what prevents them from forming honest, meaningful connections with others. Their fear of exposure doesn't just protect them from others, it also isolates them from themselves. Narcissistic men often develop an intense need for control and power, not because they are naturally dominant, but because control gives them a sense of safety and importance. When they are in charge, whether in relationships, workplaces, or social settings, they feel less vulnerable and more in command of how others see them. This craving for control is often mistaken for leadership or strength, but it is actually rooted in fear. They fear unpredictability, rejection, and being exposed as inadequate, so they try to manage everything and everyone around them. In personal relationships, this can show up as manipulation, gaslighting, or emotional domination. They may twist facts, shift blame, or create confusion to maintain the upper hand. The goal is always to keep themselves in a superior position, so they never have to feel small or powerless again. In their minds, control equals security. Unfortunately, this behavior often damages the people around them, creating a toxic environment where others feel afraid, confused, or emotionally drained. What appears to be confidence or assertiveness is actually a fragile system of emotional protection, one that depends on always being one step ahead of perceived threats. This addiction to power becomes a cycle. The more insecure they feel, the more control they seek, and the more control they gain, the more isolated and emotionally detached they become. Although narcissistic traits are deeply rooted and difficult to change, it is not impossible for a narcissistic man to grow and heal. But that journey requires something most of them resist: self-awareness and vulnerability. Change begins with recognizing that their behavior, no matter how effective it seems in protecting them, is causing harm to both themselves and others. This kind of realization is rare because it challenges the very identity they've built their lives around. Admitting flaws, accepting criticism, or acknowledging emotional pain feels like weakness to someone whose entire self-worth is based on appearing strong and flawless. That's why many narcissistic men avoid therapy or reject help. They're afraid that facing their inner world will dismantle the image they've worked so hard to create. However, for those who do take that brave step, therapy can be transformative. With the right guidance, they can begin to understand the origins of their behavior, reconnect with their emotions, and develop empathy for others. But the process is slow, uncomfortable, and often painful, because it involves breaking down years of denial and self-deception. Still, it's important to remember that narcissism is not a life sentence. It is a psychological defense that can be softened through insight, compassion, and consistent effort. Change is possible, but only when the individual is willing to stop hiding behind the mask and start facing the truth of who they are. In conclusion, understanding narcissistic behavior requires us to look beyond the surface and recognize the complex psychological factors at play. Narcissistic men are not simply arrogant or self-centered. They are individuals shaped by deep insecurities, past traumas, and emotional defenses. Behind their grandiose exterior often lies a fragile sense of self, constantly seeking validation to mask feelings of inadequacy. The behaviors we see, manipulation, control, lack of empathy, are not signs of strength but of vulnerability and fear. While it may be difficult to see at first, many narcissistic traits stem from a childhood where love was conditional or where emotional needs were unmet. These men may struggle in relationships, unable to connect authentically with others, but that doesn't mean they are beyond help. With self-awareness, therapy, and a willingness to confront their inner fears, change is possible. However, it requires vulnerability, a quality that is often feared the most. Ultimately, understanding the psychological complexity of narcissistic behavior allows us to approach these individuals with empathy and wisdom, while also protecting ourselves and setting healthy boundaries. It's important to remember that while narcissistic traits can be challenging, they are not a reflection of who the person is at their core, just a manifestation of their inner struggles. Thank you.